Thank you to those of you who have joined us today for the second session that we're running on making Polarys work for you. We know that there have been some snafus around scheduling, and the invitation and the registration didn't match. That was a time zone error, and we apologize for that. So if you registered for this but weren't able to attend right now, you may be listening to a recording which we're making so that we can share with everybody. We also know that there were a number of people who, due to the weather and the impact that that's had on school schedules, had hoped to attend but weren't able to. And so we're also going to be sharing this with them. And so if you fall into one of those camps and you're listening to this after today, the recording, then please feel free to contact us and let us know if you have any questions. We're going to hit on some of the top questions that we've received in the past at the end of the talk, and then you're always welcome to contact us. So with that said, we want to just welcome you and say that it's been our distinct pleasure and delight to be working with the NCSBA and bringing Recontext and Polarys to North Carolina over the last couple of years. This webinar today is intended to help those who are either new to the platform or who have used the platform in the past, but we've made significant upgrades and changes to it. So people are coming to us today because they either are looking for information about what's new and different, they're looking for help understanding how Polarys works and what it means, and they may be looking for more information about how do I use it in my planning process. So those are some of the things that we're going to be talking about. Through the end of the month, Polarys Premium, which includes all of the features of the platform, are completely open to North Carolina users, and many of the functions, most of the functions, continue to be available whether you're a free or a premium subscriber. So we hope you'll find that the information is useful in helping you to better serve your students and find great opportunities to target and engage in continuous improvement for your school. So the flow is going to be talking about what is Polarys scoring, what does that mean, what do the numbers mean that you're going to see on Polarys, so you understand what is the mindset that you should be in when you think about what this information is telling you. It's a little different than the way that most accountability data is analyzed. We have a different purpose and a different goal. We want the data to serve you. And so we want you to be able to understand, what does this number tell me that's unique and different about my school, and then the next piece is, now how do I access the information? There are a number of different ways that you can filter and explore your data so that you can find the information that's going to be most useful for you in using the data to improve your plan and improve service to kids. And then finally, how do I put this data into action so that I can actually use it for its intended purpose, which is to serve kids and improve service to students. Efficiency, effectiveness, all in the name of improved service is what Polarys is all about, and why we built it and why we're offering it here today. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to David Adler, and he's going to walk you through the platform. David is a career administrator and educator with a deep passion for finding targeted strategies to improve service to kids. And that is our mantra, that is our reason for being, and that is why we built Polarys. Our primary goal is always continuous improvement in service to kids. Increase efficiency and effectiveness. Schools are always under-resourced. That's not going to change anytime soon, so we need to do everything we can to make sure every dollar and every hour spent is in the best way that we can to give the kids the best opportunities that they can have to grow and thrive. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to David.
Well, thank you, Mary, and I also want to extend my personal thanks to all of you for being here, and for those of you watching on video, and to the NCSBA for their continued support and partnership. So I just want to let you know a little bit about me. Up until very recently, I was working in public schools. I'm a former assistant superintendent, principal, and this work that we're doing with Recontext is really a labor of love for me. I really believe in students. I believe in schools. Most of my experience as a teacher and administrator was spent in service of students who were from the underserved variety, a lot of very, very poor schools, both urban and rural. And what I saw in these schools was tremendous education being offered to people. The students were being well served, but the accountability metrics really weren't reflecting the job that these schools were doing. Um, so really, though, the other piece was that the parts of the education that we were offering that really needed to be moved, that really needed to be changed, it was very difficult to galvanize staff into action, to really put some pressure in the right places and really move the places that we could change. And so what I saw was that accountability really wasn't working for these schools for the purpose that it was designed to do. So I set out on this path to really help for two things. One is to support transformative leadership, to take those really dedicated professionals, the administrators, the teacher leaders, the teachers, and really help them to zoom in on the things that they could change, that needed to change, and would be high leverage practices that would move things for students. The second was to really make data accessible and useful for administrators who want to improve service to kids. Um, what we have in a lot of cases is that data is really impenetrable, and it becomes an event. You get your data once a year, you look at it, you decide on a strategy, that becomes the thing that you look at. We often call it shiny object syndrome, that the first thing in the data that jumps out at you is the thing that you latch onto. When I was an administrator, I used data, and having a background in mathematics, I was able to use data to really hone in on the things that could help my schools. And you can see on the screen, I've been able to increase student performance rather quickly, some pretty serious turnarounds, and also do it while cutting budgets and making teachers happier. So this can be done, it can be systematized, and we're going to show you some of the ways how. Now, there's nothing I love more than talking about practical strategies for improving students and kids, and I'd love to spend this hour talking about that. But we're going to narrow the focus down to this tool, Polarys, that really helps you to get into the data and hone in on some high-impact strategies for your kids. And just a quick note before we jump in, people often say to us, well, why are you guys in North Carolina? You're not from North Carolina. What brought you here? It's because of our work with the NCSBA. We were fortunate enough to meet with them, and they really saw the value and said, well, how can we bring this to our districts? And so this is why we're here. So what I want to start with is really helping you to understand what a Polarys score is. A Polarys score is a different sort of accountability measure, and it's not intended to replace the accountability measures that are being used in your state. It's really intended to supplement your understanding of how your school is doing in a more realistic way. And the idea behind it is, instead of comparing all the schools to each other and setting these seemingly arbitrary standards for student performance, what we're doing is we're individualizing accountability by comparing each and every school to a unique model school, a model of your school situated in statewide data. So what it looks like here is that we start with something like percent proficient. And often schools will look at percent proficient or similar sort of status measures, and they'll start by saying, well, here we are, we're lower in mathematics, so math is something we need to focus on. But often what we get is from our staff, when we show them these things, they often have a lot of reasons why, look, this is just how it is. So maybe they say things like, well, we're doing the best that we can. This is it. It's the students. We have poor students. We have students on IEPs. We have students who don't speak English. We've kind of hit the ceiling. We're working as hard as we can. Maybe they have questions about the test. This test, it changes every year. It's a different focus. It's different difficulty. It's really hard to predict what's being tested, and it's a moving target. And last, well, we had a tough class. We had a rough group of kids. That's just how it is. And when I was an administrator and taking over some buildings and some districts where we had a long history of underperformance, these were the walls that were thrown up by staff as to why it is that they couldn't move the students, and why it is that we shouldn't really worry about our accountability grades. We shouldn't necessarily have to move. So me, as I said, I have a degree in theoretical mathematics. I was a statistics professor and a cryptographer. I can do a lot with math. So I said, well, if I can measure something, maybe we can figure out exactly how much of this is causing this, how much of the problem with our scores is our students is the test. And I looked at the research, and the research actually supports the teacher's argument. A lot of the researchers put it between 50 and 75% of institutional exam scores are attributable to factors that are beyond the control of the school, things that we just can't touch. And that includes, a big one is socioeconomic status of the students. And it's neighborhood context, it's parents' education level, it's food security, it's so many things. And this is something that really does drive our institutional scores. But my response is, well, then let's not use the raw data. The power in data analysis is in the question you ask and how you answer it. And so I sought to build Polarys as a measure to see if we could hone in on just the impact that the school is having on student learning, and to ask a better question, which is, how are we doing as a school in serving our unique population when we factor in these key drivers of performance, specifically socioeconomics, special education status, and the language skills of the students. So when I started to use statistics to control for these factors, it gave me a performance benchmark that was unique for each school, the schools that I was working with. And so the goal, which Polarys achieved for me, was to address these three complaints: that we're doing the best we can, the test changes every year, it's just a tough class. When I was able to strip away those excuses and those reasons why the scores were, we could actually hone in and say, well, we're an underperforming school. Maybe we're not as underperforming as we're being told we are, but we still have stuff that is within our purview to improve. So if it's not the kids and it's not the test, what else is it? Is it our curriculum? Is it our teaching? Is it the way we're structured? Is it passing time? Is it discipline structures? Let's talk about the things that we can change. And this really galvanized teachers to action, and it allowed for school improvement to move forward. So we were able to remove each of these and really look specifically at not that 75%, but the part that we were in control of. Now, what does a Polarys score tell you? It's a unique way of looking at your school, and it asks the question, how would a school with our unique student body score on the standardized exams? We are not comparing you to any other schools across the state. It is in no way based on past performance. It's not a growth metric. It's not looking at how your students specifically performed in prior years. And it's not comparing individualized classrooms. It is always kept at the school level. And all analyses are always for all of the students in the school. So what we do is looking at your unique context and compare you to a model of your school built from statewide data. We create them new each year, and we're comparing your school's actual results back to that school's results, that model school's results. And so what this does is it's stripping out all the variability associated with the student demographics, language status, socioeconomics, and test variability, and grade level, and really focusing specifically on those things that are within your control. In practice, it looks a little bit like this. And you can see, if you remember the school that we were looking at, where we were 58% in mathematics and 60% in literacy, if we build up that model school and say that model school should be 56% proficient in math and 61% proficient in literacy, we can actually see that we are over what would be predicted for that school in mathematics and under in literacy. So focusing our attention in this case on literacy is really the wrong move. Focusing on math is the wrong move, and we really should be focusing our attention on literacy, because as we know, sometimes these tests are harder or more difficult year after year, and depending on subject. We've all seen that in some years and some tests, there are significantly more students statewide who are proficient in one or the other in a particular grade level test combination. And so attributing any particular gaps to us and our programming is not the right conclusion, and leads us down the wrong path. So what we should do here is really focus on how it is that we are performing relative to that model school. Now, we don't have to debate whether test difficulty matters by comparing the +2 and the -1. We don't have to do that. We don't have to talk about whether or not we have a student body that's particularly impacted by socioeconomics, limited English proficient or students with disabilities, we can really just talk about, well, look at that +2 and look at that -1, and where can we start to apply levers. So now I had this mathematical model creating this to start to create unique benchmarks for my schools. And the next step here was to say, now I know where my curriculum is, I know which subjects I need to be looking at, but now I really need to know, well, how can I move this? How can I move the needle? And to do that, I wanted to find other schools in my state, in my region, in my area that were serving demographically similar populations, but who maybe were doing better with them than I was. And that's really when Polarys was born. So the Polarys interface was built to help you answer two very specific and hard to answer questions. First, what are our best opportunities for improvement so we can target our work? Which subject areas, which grade levels, which demographic groups, where should we be looking specifically at to really start to move our school system? And then what are the best ideas that are out there in the world for moving those students? A lot of times school improvement focuses on the staff that you have within your school. You go to your lead teachers, you go to the rock star teachers that you have, you go to your administrators, and we fail to harness the wonderful things that are happening in other schools across the state. So we can learn from these schools and find out who's got the same kids we do, the same issues we do, but is really doing really well. So the Polarys inquiry cycle and the way in which we do this is the tool is built to lead you through 3 specific steps. And the first step itself is to look at your school and to find those hidden opportunities like we just were doing with the math and the reading, and you can go even deeper. The second step is to find out within demographically similar schools, who are the ones who are succeeding, who are the ones who have really promising practice. And then before we call them, and we do want to call them, and we do want to arrange site visits, to really find out what are some of the differences in policy, in resources, and in the way they're allocating those resources, the management decisions they're making, that are different between those high-performing schools and our own practice, so that we can ask questions like, what are you spending your money on? How are you deploying your staff? What programs are you using? And that we can be informed in how we do that. So before I show you Polarys, I also want to show you this, just refer to the district reports that we've created. For anyone who's watching this at a district level, we have sent free copies of these to every board chair and superintendent across the state, but if you haven't seen yours and are interested, we'll be happy to send you a PDF copy. Just email us. But we've sent you these reports that really focus specifically on looking at all of your schools and trying to find out, first of all, in section 1, what are your true peers and how does your school look in Polarys? So if you look here at this particular school, Sampson Elementary School has a Polarys ranking that is 3rd out of the 11 most demographically similar schools, including it, so 10 other schools. And you can see that of the schools that are demographically similar, 1 has an A, 1 has a B, there are 5 C's, 2 D's, and 2 F's, a very, very broad spread across, and Sampson ranks 3rd. So while there are model schools here that are getting A's and B's, this school is actually doing relatively well based on its cohort. Similarly, we can look at the Polarys scores as compared to percent proficient, and you can see here with Green Creek Elementary School that it's actually underperforming by 3% in math and outperforming by 4% in literacy, and this gives us some information about the school and where that school might be focusing. In addition, we have curricular area focus specifically broken out by subgroup, and you can see how in this case we're looking at our subgroup performance, which gives us a lot of information not only about the effectiveness of our programming, but about the efficiency. So an underperforming score, in this case, Highview Middle School, that is outperforming overall by 3%, but if you look at its subgroup scores, its students with disabilities, special education population score is lower than the rest. And this would indicate to us one of 2 things. Either that the school's programming for students with disabilities is not effective for the students with disabilities, that we need to improve the programming, or that it's inefficient and that it's using up so much of the building's resources that it's taking away from the programming for the other students. And so by looking at some of those mentor schools, some of those other schools that are outperforming, this leads us to some of the questions that we might want to ask of those higher performing schools. And you can even see where your schools are performing. For example, rank within cohort. Here, Green Creek Elementary within math for its economically disadvantaged students is 7th of the 10 to 11 schools within the cohort. So certainly a lot of room for improvement. Okay, so here now we're going to actually dive in. I'm actually going to show you very quickly here a different screen. So bear with me. Okay, so this is the Polarys front page, and there are a lot of places you can go. If you have an account, you've probably seen this before, but we're going to start here with our true peer comparison report. The school you're seeing, this is a database. It's actually real schools, but we've stripped out the names. So this is McCulloch Connolly Elementary School. It is a real school, just not by that name. So the first thing that you see when you look at the school is you're getting some information about the schools, the students it serves. 726 students, which is a relatively large elementary school. Slightly less than average students with disabilities and limited English proficient, but a rather significant economically disadvantaged population. And then you can see over on the right, the school has an accountability grade of a C and an overall score of 5% under the model school. So this is a school that is underperforming and there is room to grow. You'll notice also that it is underperforming by a greater margin in literacy than it is in mathematics. And this gives us an area for us to focus on. Now, we talked a little bit about finding those mentor schools, and you can see here with the DPI grades, our school was a C, there's a B, and there's 2 other Cs. There are some schools in there that we can certainly talk to, and we can see that their overall Polarys scores, if you remember, we were under by 5%. Here's 2 outperforming, one up by 9%, another by 11, and some that are outperforming maybe by a little bit less. If we look at the reading scores, you can see again some schools that are outperforming us, schools that are doing better than we are. And we can find out who those schools are when we dive into the Polarys interface, which I'll show you in just one second. But before we go there, we can also start to think about what are some of the management decisions that our peer schools are making. So in this case, we can see that several of the schools, 7 of the schools, have significantly higher absenteeism rates than we do. So that may not be a high leverage point for us to attack as a problem in our school that we need to attack absenteeism. Similarly, we have a lot of these schools spending less money than we do on technology. Maybe we're overspending on that. So we need to think about that. And finally, we can start to look at student-teacher ratios and find that a lot of these schools have lower student-teacher ratios than we do. So we can start to think about maybe we're a little bit out of whack, maybe we need more staffing, maybe we need to think about the way in which we've assigned our staffing. And we'll actually look deeper at all of these factors once we get into Polarys, the tool, which we'll do right now. So coming back here, now we can actually explore our data a little more. And so here, you can see some of the same information we saw before. You see that chart with the demographics. You can see the overall score. If you remember, we wanted to look at literacy. So we're going to look at that. And not only do we have that, but now we have a 5-year trajectory of what those scores have been. And if you remember, within each year, these scores are normed out. These scores are individually done within each year. So any adjustments in student population, any changes made to the test are going to be smoothed out for this. So what you're really seeing is the school has been on a generally positive trajectory for a number of years, but we had a very precipitous drop in the last year. And so that right there gives us a place to look, something to think about in terms of our own population and how we've been doing. Polarys also allows you as the user to select the factors that you would like considered in the analysis. So if we remove from the analysis the impact of students with disabilities and limited English proficient, now again, all of the students are always included in the analysis. We are not only looking at economically disadvantaged students, we're just controlling for the status. We see that we're still underperforming, but by significantly less when we look only at economically disadvantaged. Versus if we look at limited English proficient alone, we can see that we're almost 10% under, which tells us that we really need to look at our limited English proficient programming. And again, for one of two things, or perhaps both, inefficiencies or ineffectiveness. What programming are we offering to these students? It's only 2% of our building, but perhaps they're drawing a tremendous amount of resource away from the aggregate. And so we need to think about how we're programming for those students. We can see a similar thing when we look at our students with disabilities population. And again, only 10% of the population, but we are lower than that 5%. We're at about 8% under. So this tells us that we should be looking specifically at these program areas for inefficiencies and ineffectiveness. But we'll go back to looking at the overall score, the literacy score with all of the demographic factors invoked. And then we'll start to find some of these mentor schools that we can look at. So now we know what our questions are and what we're looking for, and now we're looking to solve it by trying to find some of these peer schools. So just to let you know as well, while we're doing this, one of the things that happens in Polarys is that every graph and every chart is exportable to Word. And so as you go on your journey through Polarys, it'll actually create for you, if you find a chart that's compelling, a graph that's compelling, a school that's compelling, you'll notice that at the top of every module you see these plus keys. And so you can, when you see something important that jumps out at you, you can add something to your report, and we'll actually do that in a minute. But first, we're going to look, and these are those 10 most demographically similar schools that you saw in those reports, in the district report and in the report we were looking at before. But if you're like me as an administrator, you're looking for similarity, you might notice that some of these schools are high schools or middle schools. In addition, we're a rural school. Some of these schools are in cities. That might not work for us. But you do notice, I hope, that these schools are all very demographically similar. Similar students with disabilities, limited English proficient, economically disadvantaged populations. And one of the comments we've gotten since we've done this, and if you are a Polarys user for a long time, we have added race as a category that you can match on, because this is something that people asked us to add. So if race is not important to you, you actually can unselect it and no longer match on race. But what we'll do here is we'll remove from the list the high schools and the middle schools, and we'll remove the city schools as well. So now the schools will be slightly less demographically similar because we have a smaller pool to draw from, but still you'll notice extremely high similarity, just as a general rule, across all of the domains. And all of these are elementary schools in rural, town, or suburban areas. Also, you'll notice that Polarys allows you to limit to your RESA, or you can even just put in a certain number of miles that you would like to consider, so that if you're considering site visits, you don't have to drive more than 100 miles or 150 miles or as far as you'd like. But these are our schools, and so we can, as I said, we could export this, or the first thing we probably want to do is start to compare the scores. And so now we're again looking at reading, and we're looking at these schools, and remember we were 5 percentage points under, but we have several schools here with significantly higher scores. So we would like to find out what they're doing. Now the highest performing one here is Morazic Kunde Elementary School, but you'll notice it's only been active for a year. So I'm actually going to leave that one out. You can choose to add it. You can choose whatever it is that you like. And you can click here. So the highest performing one is this Terry Kurluke. And once you click it, it gets its performance added to the graph. So you can really see how that school's performance compares to our own. In addition, as I mentioned, we may want to ask the school, you'll notice the last year we had that precipitous drop. They had an even bigger rise. So we can add this to our downloadable report. And in doing so, we get information about that school. We get their address, we get the principal's name, we get the phone number, we get the website of the school, and we can start to learn some information. And we can add questions that we might want to ask, like, what happened last year? And this will be added into a report. As I said, that we can download at the end, and it's in Word format. So we can actually cut things out of it, paste, we can manipulate that report as much as possible. So, but getting back to our schools, we'll notice that there are a couple of others here. We've got one that's 6 percentage points above, and another one here that's 4.5. These are schools that are doing very, very well, and they are improving where we maybe are not. The exception here is Schumann-Purdy has this culture of high performance. They've been a high-performing school for a long time and are starting to come down. So we might ask these schools some different questions. In particular, Schadensporer has performance that is almost identical to our own, except in this last year when they zigged and we zagged. So finding out some more about these schools and what these schools have been doing can be really important. I'll also note that not only are the schools exportable, but you can export things like this entire chart. And you can add notes to it. So you can get the names of all the schools if you want. You can do a lot of this stuff. So, sorry, it takes a minute while we run the Zoom as well. So now that image and any notes that we type in will be exportable into our document. So now that we've got our mentor schools, we've got some schools we want to dig into, now it's a question of what are they doing that we're not? What's different about these schools than our own? So now we can come over here and look at these schools in several categories. And we can look at, for example, here, spending on instruction. This is non-personnel instruction, and this is per pupil. And this leads us to some very specific guiding questions. Are we noticing that increases in spending are corresponding to increases in results? We can start to ask them, what are they spending their money on? What are the programs? What are some of the RTI protocols? And for each of the things that you might look at here, you get some of these guiding questions. For example, we note that 2 of these high-performing schools have been decreasing spending on instruction, whereas we have been increasing, along with one of the higher performing schools, Schadensporer. So this allows us to really look at some of those differences and start to think about, what is it? What are the spending? What are we been spending on, and is it really working? And how are these schools cutting but still having high performance? Another one that we like to look at here is local revenues. And we think of local revenues not only as a funding issue, but it's also a proxy measure for community's engagement in the school system. And you can see that our school, McCullough Connolly, is the lowest in terms of per pupil revenues from local government. And this maybe is a place where we can go and say to our local school board or the county government that, here's some of the differentials between us and the high performing schools. In addition, you can see, what are these schools getting in? In some cases, they're getting $750 per student more than we are, $800 more per student than we are. For a school of 700 students, that's a significant amount of money. So what could we be spending that money on? What could we be doing with it? Another thing that we could look at is staffing for teachers. This is student-teacher ratios, and the statistic we're using is actually teachers per 1,000 students. And you'll notice that we actually have more teachers per 1,000 students than 2 of the high-performing schools. So how are those schools deploying their staff? Do they have larger class sizes? Are they offering more specials, more additional courses that they could take? What is it that they're doing specifically with their staffing? And this leads us to these questions about what these high-performing schools are doing that we are not doing. Finally, at the end, you come to your next steps. So now you've gone through all of this data. The last thing you can do is you can download your report. As I said, it comes out in Word, so you can cut and paste and edit everything. You can also share your learning. This is available to anybody and everybody. There are links to some free protocols on our sites that you can look at, free materials and resources that you can use to empower your data team meetings. And last, those schools that you put in here, if you remember, we added a school to our report, you get where they are on a map, you get their address, you get all of that information, and you can see how far you might have to go get to them. In this case, 10 miles. So it tells you where these schools are so that you can really start to think about this. So this is what Polarys does for you. It's really designed to walk you through a data-rich process and to really think about how you can use the data, look at it in a new way, and as I said, really start by looking at your school's data and think about the opportunities for improvement, then find partners who can help you to improve, and then really develop a good understanding and create some good questions so that you can then call and visit those schools in a very, very directed way so that you know what it is that you're looking for. So this is what we designed Polarys to do. And so now we'll go back to our slideshow. There we go. Okay. Oh, sorry, we're getting a little hang up for a second. My apologies. Having some technical difficulties. Okay. Many apologies. Okay. So here we go. So let's think about how you can use a tool like Polarys to really improve your school. You know, when we want to talk about ways that people do strategic planning, specifically data-informed decision making, on the left you see some of the areas that people often are using data. People are doing it when they're doing their budgets, when they're looking at low-performing schools, when they're evaluating whether or not a specific program is working or not working, and they're looking for data to support these things. They're looking for achievement data, they're looking for budget data, and this is very, very standard. But you also can add data to these processes by looking at specifically things like, well, scheduling. How are we scheduling our students? What classes are we putting them in? What teachers are we putting them with to make sure that we have the highest impact? We can look at class composition, which students belong together. We can start to think about data-rich processes that help put students together with students of common need, common strength, common interest. A lot of schools use very informal processes or think about it in terms of a logistical exercise rather than one that really focuses on student need. Another one is looking at curriculum and looking at how the curriculum has driven student performance and looking at differentials across the school. Are teachers who've attended PD, a certain PD, better at implementing curriculum than others? Is there a support component? Is there a time of day component? Thinking about things like that. And last, staffing assignments. Which teachers should be teaching which classes? Which teachers have greatest strength with particular age groups, particular content areas, with particular students? And thinking about the ways to really maximize what we're doing. You can use data to inform all of these, and Polarys can be a part of it, but you can go significantly deeper than that. This is a typical school planning process, and we'll show you a way to maybe supercharge this a little bit. When we talk about data-informed decision-making, schools often have processes, and it looks often like this, where you start to look for opportunities. Which are the programs we should focus on? Which are the subjects we should be bolstering? Where should we invest? And once you find, as we call the shiny objects, but once you find that thing that you want to focus on, people start to make action plans, and they start asking questions like, well, what has been working? What have we done historically? Where should we start? And we gather that information from our staff. Usually we have our rockstar teachers, our school improvement teams that are internal and are steeped in our own context. And then once we've implemented our plans and we've gone all the way around the cycle, then we sort of do a postmortem and we say, well, what did we notice in the data for our monitoring? What happened to the scores? What happened to our benchmarks? What happened to attendance? We have a slightly different approach, and if you have worked with us in the past, this will look familiar. This is the Recontext Solutions inquiry cycle that we use as a way to drive data team meetings. If you are familiar with this, you'll note some differences. We've actually added spaces where you can use Polarys in your inquiry cycle. But it's based on a philosophy that data is only useful when it answers the specific questions you have. And so this looks an awful lot like, and is an awful lot like, the scientific method. So the idea is that you just start by establishing your questions. what is it that you want to know about your school? And then once you have those questions, establish your measures. And this is where Polarys can make a really good measure, because it's measuring how your school is doing with your specific population and thinking about performance relative to realistic expectations for your school. Now, when you start to gather your evidence and establish your measures and review and refine, now you're looking at your true peers and you're looking at, well, how can things be different with similar students? What are some of those key differences? And this ultimately helps you to create and implement your plan, which should include monitoring. We cannot stress this enough. Your monitoring plan should be written at the same time you write your action plan, so that it is no surprise to anybody when you get at the end and you say, well, we said our Polarys scores were going to go up by 5% in a year, and they went up by 2%, or they went up by 10%, that we're all in agreement that this is the benchmark of quality for ourselves, so that we don't argue over things like, well, we saw absenteeism go down, but we saw scores go down too. Instead of cherry picking the evidence to support an argument, we settle that on the front end. So let's look at how Polarys was used in this example in McCullough Elementary School, specifically to answer some of those hard questions we referred to. So where are we showing room to grow? Well, we saw room to grow with our LEP and IEP programming, so we should look for inefficiencies and ineffectiveness there. We learned that we should be focusing on literacy rather than mathematics, and we found 3 high-performing peers that we could be using as mentors. We found some key differences, specifically in instructional spending and local revenues, and you could go on and on looking through more of those categories. And then this question of, were we seeing growth? And one of the things that's really important, especially if you're an underperforming school, is not only looking at whether or not you are performing, but what your trajectory is. If your school is actually is low but increasing, you're going to want to support those programs that are leading to that increase and not abandon them because your scores are low. Versus the school that we looked at, we saw that actually things were on the downslope. And so we needed to make some changes. And were any of those true peers seeing growth? Well, 2 of them were. One of them was coming down, but 2 of those schools were on the upward trend. So talking to them about what it was that they've implemented most recently. So just to leave you with this idea, there are things that you can do right now to make the most of Polarys. If you're a user, we encourage you to use the additional reporting and sharing features to look at your data, and if you've used it before, there's a lot more to it now to look at the racial demographics and explore the new true peer sets using our new search tools. If you're new to Polarys, please sign up, get a free account, look at all the data on your school. It's still free for another week. And you can reach out to us. We're happy to help. We'll be happy to walk you through your data and show you how it all works. We're going to be back in North Carolina for our annual summer boot camp, and we'll teach you how to do data-informed decision-making cycles, how to create data-informed school improvement plans, and really focus on specifically your problems. You'll notice that we have our district report, as we said. If there's anybody out there who did not get our district report, please contact us and we'll be happy to share it with you. The protocols are available on our website, and they're free to anybody, whether you are a Polarys subscriber or not. And please don't hesitate to contact us. My email address is david@recontextsolutions.com. We'll be happy to answer any questions you have, to look at your data with you, and to really talk to you about what it is that we can do. And so with that, let's see if we have any questions.
So one of the questions that we have been asked quite a bit, and I think it's a good place to start, is what is the difference between this and some of the other data that they have right now, and how does this link to how does this link to the school improvement process, the NC STAR system that's used across the state?
That's a big question. So in school accountability, we often talk about 2 families of accountability metrics. Status metrics, which measure where a school is at a point in time. And so things like percent proficient, or achievement scores, or mean scale score are examples of status metrics. And then growth metrics, and there's several of them. Student growth percentiles are an example. And EVOS, which is a value-added measure, is one of these growth metrics. And so, and what EVOS does is it looks at individualized student data and plots growth trajectories and then compares students, individual students, back to those growth trajectories. VAMs in general are a relatively controversial measure, but ours measure works in a very, very different way. So Polarys is a status measure, it's not a growth measure, and it's norming away the impact of all of the factors we've normed away by looking specifically contained within 1 year's data set. So it's just measuring a different thing, and it's answering a totally different question. We say the best way to use a measure like Polarys is actually in conjunction with the other measures. When you go to the doctor, you don't just get weighed and they say, okay, this is how much you weigh, therefore this is your health prognosis. They look at your pulse, they look at your temperature, they look at your blood pressure, they might take blood tests, they do a lot of other things. And we think that looking at schools through a variety of lenses also helps you develop a much better understanding of where that school is. So we would encourage you to look at all of the measures that are available to you and use Polarys to really inform by asking a different question, the question of how you're doing in serving your unique students. The second part of that question about NC STAR and school improvement planning, NC STAR is a tool that helps you to really organize your thinking and aggregate and keep track of what it is that you're doing. Polarys as a measure and as a thought cycle really fits rather well in with NC STAR. And you can document your journey, you can document the thoughts, you can document your meetings, and how you know what you need to work on and how you're going to monitor your progress can all be documented rather well within NC STAR.
Thank you. The other question that we are getting here, and I'm noticing that we only have about 5 more minutes, so this will be the last question, is what is the difference between premium and free? Why, what's the advantage? And so this is one that I will be happy to take. So the difference between the premium and the free subscription is that there are a number of key reports that we provide to premium subscribers that kind of fast forward the research process for you. And so that's something that we've been asked for help on, and we're happy to provide that. The other thing is that premium subscribers are given access to a longer list of schools that they might want to partner with, the true peer schools, and a few more filtering options to help find the right school for the right challenge. So those are the big differences. And of course, it also comes with personalized support. So if you subscribe to the premium Polarys, then it also comes with 10 hours of support. So those are the big differences. The metric itself, so one of the questions that we've had from people is, why, does it make sense for me to put a metric like this that maybe next year I'm not going to subscribe, or maybe like we'll not subscribe in a couple of years, and can I still use the metric? The metric will still be available. You'll still be able to access your Polarys score and use that as a way to monitor your progress, even if you're not a premium subscriber over time. So the value of the information is there as you bake it into your accountability plans or your school improvement cycle and your progress monitoring plans, whether or not you continue to subscribe. So the premium subscription offers more targeted support and more robust information, but the information will always be available for you so that you can continue to use this information for progress monitoring. As we said earlier, we are partnered with the NCSBA, and that's been a delightful partnership. They're an amazing organization, and we are really honored to work with them. And if you have any questions that are specifically about the work that we're doing in North Carolina, we're going to be coming and working with schools in July in North Carolina. We're going to be sending out more information about that soon. And if you would like some support, that's a good opportunity to get the targeted support using the data to improve your strategic decision making. And you can always contact us if you have any questions. So we want to thank everybody who was able to make it today. And again, thank you if you're listening to this after the fact for joining us. And if you have any questions, just reach out to us anytime at we're at recontextsolutions.com. Thank you.